Welcome back. Now, the South African economy grew by 0.6% in the fourth quarter of 2024. That's actually a recovery from the previous quarter, because in the previous 3 months, it was a decline of around 0.1%. Now, the expansion or that rise did fall short, though, of that 0.9% that was predicted initially. But it was enough to prevent the country from entering any kind of recession. 3 sectors primarily showed positive growth. It was agriculture, finance, and trade. Those 3 led the way. The economy expanded by 0.6% in 2024 as a whole, after a revised 0.7% rise in the previous year. I'm joined now by Phelisa Nkomo, a development economist as well as Oxfam board chair, joining us in studio. Phelisa, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Good morning.
Let's explain this as simple as possible. Why should these matters number? Why should these numbers matter, should I say?
These numbers matters a lot, right? I think for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think South Africans, once we hear positive stories, that's the one thing. And I mean, to have a agricultural sector, which is very labor-intensive sector, to show positive signs of growth. However, these numbers are not, the dent they're making in the economy is very minimal. So meaning that if you're really in the margins of the economy, you're going to benefit very little, right? But people who are really in the belly of the economy in these sectors are likely to benefit. But there's something we even have to interrogate, even with the finance, for instance. The finance sector, even though it has grown, but also one of the key things we must always be concerned about, because South Africa is a dualistic economy, right?
Meaning? Like if we explain to our audience.
So yes, it means that we have a portion of bigger citizens who are completely in the informal sector, who are either unemployed, 32.9% were unemployed. The second group is actually in the informal sector. And then the third group is actually in the vulnerable sector, which is they do domestic services, they are cleaning, they're cashiers, and they're in the retail sector. So then you have a smaller portion that's either in the public sector or that are earning actually just above 40%. I mean, just, that are earning good income. So in essence, it means that actually the possibility is that because these, you have this bigger portion of the population that is in the margins of the economy, most of the people actually don't really benefit, right? So the finance sector has actually designed systems that are kind of like very extractive. So that's what we'd call in heterodox. And give me just 1 minute to really break down what that means. Amongst the key things that they do is that when the economy kind of like shows positive signs, the first thing they do is that they extend credit, right? So we normally make a joke and say that you have a generation that is credit worthy, but that has no assets. So amongst those is that they're going to have all of a sudden these highly increased credit cards, right? Overdraft.
Yes.
But at the same time, in overall, part of these positive sentiments around the economy is that, remember, we experienced expansionary monetary policy. We had at least a little bit of a relief, almost 3 quarters.
Which means that we had low interest rates at the time, which meant we could borrow more money, we could hopefully spend more money as well.
Absolutely.
But it didn't help, did it?
In fact, I mean, just to digress for a second, that's why there's this massive tension about the VAT, the potential VAT increase.
Yes.
Because the biggest fear is that the VAT increase is actually, again, designed to extract the small surpluses or the breather. In fact, I don't even want to call them surpluses, by the way, because really, we have been, since COVID, we've been subjected to almost 9 to 10 interest rate increases. So they're just when families are really breathing, because some of these expansionary monetary policies were really nominal. Families were not really experiencing a lot of more extra cash. But the January one, I think that's when families, households were starting to experience a lot more cash. And then they were actually starting to say that I have an extra income that I could start thinking about it. And in fact, you're already starting to see on the household expenditure that at least there's a lot more stability. And there's from a consumer perspective is that you can see that people are just starting to step out to go out and spend because they are experiencing a small extra cash.
So where does that small extra cash come from? Because it's not as if things have gotten any better per se. We're still plus minus the salaries are, if you take inflation into account, real wages haven't really increased sizably. You still have a weakened economy. So in order for you to spend more, it's going to be an aspect of just confidence and feeling like things are going to get better in the end. and maybe the impact of lower interest rates. Do we have all of those happening right now? Is that why you're perhaps going to see an increase in spending?
Yes, I mean, I think interest rate is always one of the natural triggers, because there are two things that happens. Is that you're seeing businesses, once they have an interest rate decline, businesses have a lot more high appetite to actually expand their business.
Yes.
So they start knocking to the banks and say, listen, I was thinking of building 10 bottles, to manufacture 10 bottles, but now with this interest rate, I want to do 20, right? Will you extend me credit, right? So naturally, that extension of credit, you actually see it you then have a small demand for labor, because, by the way, this GDP ratio as well must always be read with other variables in the economy. So the growth in the agricultural sector, is that concomitant with the growth in terms of employment, for instance, and other aspects that are related with the agricultural sector?
I want you to go to this picture very quickly. If you take a look at that, that's from Stats SA, right? And they're ultimately saying that the only times that South Africa has ever had negative growth as a country is during a crisis. 2008, 2009 financial crisis, there South Africa goes into the red. 2020, COVID health crisis, then South Africa goes into the red. The problem becomes, other than the 1 year in which we recover post that, we don't often hit 2% enough for us to grow. And with our population then growing by more than 1.3% per year, we need to grow more than our population in order to get any kind of growth. Is it because we're not spending right? Are our priorities wrong as a country? Where are we getting it wrong?
Absolutely correct. Now, firstly, South African population is growing at between 1.4% to 1.6%, right? The second issue is that our capital gross formation has really been declining.
What's that?
All right. Infrastructure spending.
Yes.
Right?
There we go.
So, meaning that between 2006, we're sitting at 26%.
Yes.
It's declined dramatically to below 10%.
That's
now,
incredible.
why that is important? In fact, by the way, the coincidence is that the president was in the city of Johannesburg 2 days ago.
Yes.
And he is in a state of shock about the decaying infrastructure. And it also means that the Minister of Finance and the team that is meant to boost infrastructure has not briefed him well and say, actually, President, this budget line item has actually been on the decline. And one of the key things why infrastructure spending has to be on the rise, it does several things. It does what we call supply side and demand side activation. It means that if you and I, Arabella, are entrepreneurs in the infrastructure sector, it means that we're going to get business opportunities.
Yes.
But also in addition to that, it means that we're going to start demanding labor, meaning that employing a lot more people. Now, there's a lot more circulation of income. So as heterodox economists, we've been calling for the president and provincial governments and municipalities to turn this country into a construction site. Because then if you do that, is that you're not even going to have these problems around tax base, etc. So that's the first thing. And then the second issue, part of that dip also has to do with the fact that you've seen government just broadly declining its expenditure. Now, austerity measures, budget cuts, we call it austerity measures in Chrome. You know, every stream has its own jargon.
Yes.
So austerity measures, let me just say for some budget cuts. Amongst the key things that it does is that it shrinks the economy and it does not inspire confidence in the public in the private sector.
Yes.
Because investment always get its inspiration from government. The third issue is that we've not really been very clearly around the industrial development strategy of this country. We've allowed the industrial development of this country to be driven by private sector. Now, I mean, for all intents and purposes, private sector's interest is profit maximization. So they would always like make sure that if they have to manufacture this table cheaper, they'll look at every option. But government needs to encourage them that manufacture this table here in South Africa because we think that you can employ 6 people.
Yes.
But private sector, if they're driving industrial development, they will just bring in the table and then it gets assembled by 3 people.
Phelisa, you know what this sounds like?
Yeah.
It sounds like America first.
Yes.
You know how the United States President Donald Trump keeps saying, let's build everything in South Africa or in the United States. Let's make sure that it's all built there because that will ultimately create the growth. Do we need to start thinking a little bit like that? I'm not saying be as protectionist as Donald Trump is, but do we need to start saying to ourselves, actually, you know what? We need to start putting South Africa first, because otherwise we're going to fail.
No, absolutely. In fact, by the way, what Donald Trump is doing with even his own announcement, I would not want even to take even a minute to talk about it. But Donald Trump is negotiating terms of trade, both globally and domestically.
Yes.
With all his announcements, right? But also what Donald Trump fundamentally does, he's providing what we would call a small window, a silver bullet for governments in developing countries and global south, emerging economies, to start reorganizing themselves. One of the key things that we need to know is that, you know, with the dip that South Africa is actually experiencing, its counterparts within the emerging economies are growing at 3.5% and 4% and above.
We're the lowest of the emerging market nations.
Because what they've done is they've come back and said the strategic sectors of our economy are the following. You know, in 1994, South Africa had almost just above industrial capacity, meaning that 40% of everything else that was consumed in the economy was manufactured domestically.
Wow.
It had its own complications because it was a white-dominated economy. But it meant that, though, we had a domination of certain sectors, right? But now we're sitting at 19%. So it means that literally 81% of the things that we consume in this economy are coming from outside. So South Africa first is important. But South Africa remains, because it's a highly industrialized country in the African continent, right? It has actually an opportunity to really regroup. I mean, we must never waste a crisis. Every crisis that comes through presents an opportunity. But what it requires agility in terms of economic planning. It requires a better, coherent industrial architecture that is coordinated between all economic sectors and economic actors. It's government that charts the way forward, is the private sector. And part of that charting the way forward, by the way, is not only just in paper in terms of policy. You resource the industrial policy, you coordinate from a human capital perspective, because you want young people who are coming out of the schooling system to be able to either be channeled into entrepreneurship or labor. You want private sector to come in and say, these are the demands of skills that we need for us to fulfill this industrial policy. You need to talk to workers, unions, right? I mean, one of the key things we've not had a conversation about is the need to invest in the upskilling of workers. Currently, Eskom is going through an unbundling. It's introducing new technologies. You have several workers at Eskom who were at school in 1990 or 2000 who are going to require upskilling. But the risk that you have, if you don't invest in upskilling, what's going to be the immediate reaction is that we're going to have to retrench. But this is something we need to integrate in our own planning. And if we are not properly coordinated, we're always going to be sitting on crisis after another crisis. The growth crisis in South Africa is not going to go away without a clear, agile economic planning and leadership that's come from government. I
just need a yes or no, because I've run out of time. Do we need a new NDP?
Yes.
See if we even get one. It's such a short time span. Phelisa, thank you so much. Always good chatting to you. Really appreciate it. I didn't even get to ask you about the budget that's coming up this week. It's going to get crazy. So hopefully you'll join us as well during the week. Phelisa Nkomo is development economist as well as Oxfam board chairperson, then joining us here in studio.